Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pines with Aquinas. So in this episode, we're going to think and talk a little bit about demons. Folks nowadays have a lot of questions about demons. Matt had Father Vincent Lampert on the channel maybe about a year ago to talk about exorcism, and that provoked a lot of conversation, and it garnered a lot of questions. So yeah, people are wondering, I don't know, how did the demons fall? Or can a demon influence my thoughts? Or how do I know that a demon is at work in somebody who seems oppressed or possessed? So we're going to start here with the question of how it is that the demons fall, because it's one that St. Thomas speculated on, and it's also one that's super helpful for our own spiritual journey, for avoiding certain traps or certain pitfalls, which can keep us from growing in the faith and growing in the love which God pours into our hearts. So here we go. Let's get after it. All right, I think at the outset it's good to acknowledge that it's just a tough question to answer, because it seems like the demons had it all, and yet they chose against God, which is staggering. And certainly it's humbling in our own case when we recognize the fact that God has been so good to us, and yet it's possible to turn from him, which is like, yeah. Okay, so the demons were created as angels, right? You know this. And they were created in grace, so they were created good. And they were created with everything that they needed for the worship of God and for their ministrations on earth. So God created them with a spiritual nature, endowed with grace, and all of these infused thoughts about supernatural realities and natural realities so that they could conduct themselves in the best imaginable way possible. Best imaginable way possible. Thank you. And the demons, by virtue of the fact that they were angels with an angelic intellect, they had a keen insight into, who they are, who they were, and what they were for. So they knew, for instance, that they were from God and that they were for God. That was inevitable. Like, they couldn't get around that fact. They're too smart not to recognize it. But for them, there was a choice of whether they would be from God and for God in the way that God willed. All right? So they had to affirm the fact that they were from God and for God. And the demons failed to affirm it, or we could simply say they chose against it. They sinned. So how is this even possible, you might ask? It seems like, given that they know what they know, how could they conceive of anything other than the praise and glory of God? Well, St. Thomas gives this example in the Summa, where he talks about what it means to be like ruled by a higher law. So God can't do anything but be God and act as God, because there's no other, conceivable option for God, because he is just very being itself, subsisting through itself. All right. God just is to be, both in like the noun sense and in the verb sense, purified of all the creaturely limitations which we associate with it. And God's not ruled by higher law. God is the highest law. So God can't but be God in a godly way. Okay. But for all creatures, we are ruled by a higher law, which is to say we are ruled by God's nature, and we are ruled by God's revelation and the gift of his grace. And St. Thomas has this image that he uses to describe it. He says, picture a hand that is etching something. Okay, so you've got like a tablet covered in wax, and you've got a little stylus, and you're etching things. He says, if the rule or the norm or the standard of the etching is just the hand's etching, then it cannot but etch well. So if somebody were to say like, hey, what are you doing over there? Like, what are you etching? You would just say, I'm etching. My hand is etching. And they'd be like, oh, cool. You're killing it. Keep going. But St. Thomas adds, if there's a higher standard according to which the hand etches, so if like the artist has a notion in his mind of what he wants to etch, or if he's trying to portray some, like plant that he has encountered along the way in his meanderings, all right, then that can be better or worse, all right? So the image that he etches can be judged better or worse on whether it conforms, to the idea in his mind or to the thing that he encounters in reality. So in the case of an angel, because we're talking about a created nature, we're talking about something that is patterned on God's being, all right, and patterned on God's knowing. And as a result of which, something can be better or worse in the way that it approximates God. And, like we know this in our own experience. So we try to grow in virtue so that we more perfectly give testimony, or we more perfectly give witness to the glory of God within us. Because, so we just are God's idea of us, but we more or less excellently, that's a weird way to pause in the middle of a sentence. We more or less excellently portray the glory of God to the degree or extent that we grow in virtue, right? That we grow in the life of grace, that we step into our vocation, that we live excellently and courageously and well. Okay. So in the case of angels, because the standard, the norm, the pattern of their flourishing is just God himself, all right? Then they can, they can fail by comparison, right? They can fail to, live up, as it were, to that standard or to that norm. So it's at least conceivable that they could sin. And so far, we've just described the sin as failing to affirm or failing to recognize, failing to abide by the fact that they're from God and for God in the way that God willed. And what was the way that God willed? Well, God willed that they be from Him and for Him as a gift, okay? So they were created in grace with the idea that by that grace, they would return to, kind of heart of Trinitarian communion, that they would return to God Himself. But, and here St. Thomas speculates as to what it is that they did when they sinned, and he says it's effectively a rejection of this gift. It's a rejection of God's gratuity, because they couldn't abide by the terms of the gift. So if you're going to live as a gift, you have to receive that gift and acknowledge that gift, and you have to offer that gift back. But the demons were like, nay, I'd rather go my own way. Did I just quote High School Musical? I think I did. So St. Thomas says, what exactly is this sin that we're describing here? Well, he says angels have a spiritual nature, so their sin would have been a spiritual sin. And he says for that we have two candidates, envy or pride. Envy is actually what a 16th century Jesuit Francisco Suarez, or 16th and 17th century Jesuit Francisco Suarez speculates was the root of their sin. He says the angels saw that the second person of the most blessed Trinity was to take human flesh, right, to become incarnate as a man, not as an angel. That caused them envy that they were skipped over in the divine plan, that they were skipped over for this great honor, this great dignity. And so they rebelled against it. So that would be an example of if the angels were to have sinned by envy, it might have looked something like that. St. Thomas, though, says, no, it's probably, or it's more likely to have been pride, okay, which is, like the root of all sin. Radix malorum est, no, cupiditas, whatever. It's the most grave of spiritual sins. It's the most, what would you say, the most black of sins. So then what would it have been, or what would it have looked like? He says, maybe it was the fact that they were like, okay, I'm from God and for God, but I don't want God's grace in order for that movement to transpire. I want to get to God on my own steam. Or he says it might have been the fact that they just rejected the fact that God was their end and said, I'll have myself for my end. And certainly, we hear that one line from the scriptures, non serviam, I will not serve, seems to suggest something along those lines. So their pride is an acknowledgement of the fact, their pride suggests that they esteemed themselves too great, all right? Either they thought themselves the end, or they thought their resources sufficient in order to attain to beatitude. And that was ill-founded, okay? And it wasn't just a matter of ignorance, or it wasn't just a matter of error, because it's more so a matter of malice, of the twisting of their wills, because they could not abide by the gift. They could not receive the gift. They could not thank the gift, thank for the gift. And as a result of which, their twisted wills send them to, a place at a distance from God, a place which excludes the dominion of God, insofar as that's possible. So then, applying this to our own lives, right? The most fundamental or basic fact of being created is having life, right? Having your being on loan from God and referred to God. And then we see this refracted in the spiritual order, in the supernatural order, in the life of grace. So if we amount to anything in the spiritual life, it is God's gift. It is absolutely 100% God's gift. So you might think yourself very disciplined. You might think yourself very sturdy when it comes to the virtuous life. That's great. God be praised, okay? 1 Corinthians 4, what do we have that we have not received? If therefore we have received it, why do we behave, or why do we act as if it were our own, okay? And then I want to say it's in James 1, every good and perfect gift comes down to us from the Father of lights. So the Christian life begins with the recognition that everything we have from God, and as a result of which we should refer it back to Him in acknowledgement and in praise. And only in so doing, both in the order of nature and in the order of supernature, can we hope to avoid the type of pride which sets us at a distance from God and which begins to introduce into our lives a kind of resentment that we must receive from Him, a kind of resentment that we must refer to Him, a kind of resentment that we must abide with Him. So the angels show us, or the demons, I should say, show us by contrast how the spiritual life is to be lived and how we are to flourish in it, which is great and good. So God makes all things work to the good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Boom, a couple of announcements. First, check out Godsplaining, which is a podcast of the Dominican Friars to which I contribute. Episodes on Thursdays, meditations on the readings on Saturdays and Sundays, and then guests and live streams. You can check all those things out. Also, Godsplaining is having retreats. So we have a retreat for all comers, a retreat for young adults, and a retreat like a young men's wilderness retreat. And those are in July and in August. And the signups for those, the applications for those are on godsplaining.org. Also, right now, the Dominican Friars Province of St. Joseph, to which I pertain, is running a fundraising event. And you can check that out at dominicanfriars.org. Thanks for your generosity in considering a gift. And then this is Pints with Aquinas. So the last word goes to Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel, push the bell, get sweet emails with sweet updates about sweet videos, which can help you in your sweet conversion. I think I used sweet there 4 times. That was intentional. So that's all for me. So please pray for me, and I'll continue to pray for you, and I will catch you next time on Pints with Aquinas. Cheers.